So we'll be setting up as a party multiple times. Could I just see it? That means not really confused there.
All right, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Dustin Ranglack. I've been Joe's advisor for the past 2 years on this bison project, and I am just incredibly proud and excited to introduce her today. Joe came to us from Theodore Roosevelt National Park, where she had been for 4 years after an undergraduate at Colorado State University, to work on this question of scaled ecology in bison. And this particular project has been a real challenge, and it's been very different than what a lot of graduate students go through. I mean, this was as Joe will talk to you about, a very in-depth, thorough literature review and meta-analysis of bison ecology on the whole. And so there are probably very few people in the world that have read as much of the bison literature and tried to glean something from it as Joe has at this point. And I am just incredibly proud of the work that she has done and put into this. And I'm excited to introduce her to you all today. So, Joe.
All right, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to go ahead and minimize my screen over here so that I can have everything ready for myself. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dustin. It has been quite an exciting 2 years. And thank you to everyone who could make it today and digitally. I'm happy and excited to share the culmination of my graduate work with you all, and my thesis titled Scaled Ecology, a Framework for Evaluating Conservation of Wildlife Ecological Processes. Having a bit of a malfunction. There we go. There we go. Got it going. So first, I'd like to make some acknowledgements before we get going. I'd like to acknowledge the South Dakota State University Center of Excellence for Bison Studies, where I got some of my summer research funding, as well as UNK for the academic funding I received here in my TA-ship. Also, I'd like to thank and acknowledge the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Bison Specialist Group, from here on out known as the IUCN or BSG. Glenn Plum and colleagues, where this initial research question that were proposed for the study were formed. And my committee members as a whole for all their assistance and contribution to the success of this project. I'd like to also thank my friends, family, and my fiance who have helped support me through the last 1.5 years. This is an outline of my presentation approach. I'll start with an introduction, go into my research questions, hypothesis and objectives, and then I'll go over each objective with the methodology and results, and then go into some implications, future research, and finally a conclusion. In the upper left-hand corner, these individual sections are going to be listed, identifying where the objectives were, or where we are in the presentation, just in case anybody gets lost. So jumping right in, nature is scaled in time and space. Scaling in this way refers to certain processes occurring over small scales of time and space and other processes occurring over larger ones. An example is fire, hydrology, ecology. We see it in all forms of the natural world. For fire, ignition, for example, occurs over a few seconds and a few inches. But fire frequency occurs over years and entire regions. Wildlife ecological processes are scaled in time and space as well. Take herbivory, for example. An animal taking one bite of forage or browse is something that occurs over a few seconds and a few inches. This scales up into time and space as the collection of bites creates a map of foraged and browse locations over longer periods of time. So the ecology of this process is scaled in time and space. Wildlife are often the engineers or facilitators of ecological processes and contribute to the maintenance of unique habitats, ecosystems, and communities. So it's likely that wildlife species in totality have scaled ecology as well. However, total species ecology is rarely incorporated on spatiotemporal scales in research because many of them focus on individual ecological processes or abundance and distribution. In this context, mapping a species' total ecological processes over time and space could provide valuable insight for species conservation. This is particularly true for range-restricted species. Large mammals face spatial restriction due to physical, political, and economic boundaries globally, the effects of which are cause of concern for their future. American bison, as they are spatially restricted in most places, but not all, provide a unique situation in which to test this theoretical framework of scaled ecology. Bison have a unique history, having dominated the American Western landscape with at least 30 million individuals, likely more, during the early to mid 1800s. Multiple accounts described bison as a sea across an unending plain, and traveling through a herd could take days at a time. However, bison were exterminated, or nearly exterminated, by the 1880s due to market hunting for hides, but more importantly, since they were a lifeline to Native Indigenous communities, bison eradication was a direct US military action as a way to subjugate Indigenous peoples. The survival of the species can be attributed to a few passionate private citizens and federal sanctuaries. However, conservation biology as a discipline did not emerge until the 1970s, and thus management of animals was primarily approached through established animal husbandry practices. So they were fenced in small areas, fed, and bred. This set the stage for the next 150 years of treating bison a little bit differently than we do any other wildlife species. I think this picture here captures this story quite well, as it's dated to 1910 in South Dakota. At this time, there were less than 1,000 bison in America, and these two were pulling a cart. Bison were perceived as successfully restored at around 1930, with around 20,000 individuals, and conservation efforts kind of plateaued at that point. Bison recovery is a notable example of large mammal conservation, but it's mostly numerical, and it has caveats. Bison became a domestic economic pursuit, and now over the 400,000 plus bison that we have, 97% undergo selection for commercial purposes. This has dominated perceptions of what bison are for roughly 3 generations. This creates a complex and unique situation as research continues to identify bison as an ecologically and culturally important wildlife species. The IUCN Red List, which identifies the likelihood of species becoming extinct in the future, has wild bison at near threatened, as the few populations that exist are in relatively safe and protected locations. However, the IUCN Green List assessment assesses the impact of actions on conservation success and potential recovery, of which bison are critically depleted, since they are restricted from ecological functionality in the majority of their historical range. So the challenge for conserving bison as wildlife persists. I propose that evaluating the totality of bison ecology as it occurs on spatial and temporal scales may open doors for increased recognition of necessities in species ecology to improve our conservation efforts. This is all in the face of complex, clouded, and intensive management of this very unique species. So I hypothesize that bison ecology is scaled in time and space, offering certain processes within small scales and others at large scales, influenced by variable, intensive, and complex management practices. In other words, since ecological components, ecological processes are scaled in time and space, like we mentioned before, I believe that the entirety of bison ecology, everything that makes a bison, is scaled in time and space. I'll be going through each of these objectives individually, then bringing some of the major conclusions and implications together at the end of this presentation. My first objective was to identify spatial and temporal scales of instrumental bison ecological processes through systematic review from the relevant literature. Next, I was to create a heuristic model of bison ecology over time and space to serve as an exemplar for visualizing scaled wildlife ecology. And lastly, using the information that I gained identify areas where management needs to adapt if we're going to conserve bison ecology into the future. So jumping right into the first objective, Dr. Plum and the IUCN BSG, along with other collaborators, first posed some of the questions for ecological scale in 2016. The BSG compiled a list of literature for review for this project between the years of 2016 and 2021. 164 sources were provided, spanning the years of 1889 to 2020. I had predetermined inclusion and exclusion criteria, of which it excluded research on European bison and focused on American bison of both the plains and wood subspecies. Research associated with the commercial bison industry was excluded. I want to state that while the American bison situation occurs across a spectrum of wildness due to the varying management intensity and complexity, I included records on bison herds that most closely match the criteria for wild by the IUCN and Rogers 2021. To complement the compiled list by the BSG, I performed a database search following PRISMA guidelines, which is the preferred reporting systems for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Using the advanced search engine of Google Scholar, I searched for records that must include the word bison and included at least one of the words of ecology, activity, genetics, habitat, demography, space, or time. I reviewed the first 300 records in order from the most recent publication and by relevance to the search terms. Extracted data was categorized within 4 nested ecological processes with more specific components associated. These processes were activity and behavior, where you see group size, rut, social dominance. Movement, where you can see migration, range expansion, movement between feeding patches. Habitat interactions, where we see fire, wallowing behavior. And lastly, demography and genetics. Altogether, this created 26 components of ecological processes. These groupings encompass most known key elements of bison ecology. So this is a PRISMA style flowchart for the literature exclusion process. The bison specialist group compiled list is located on the left side of this graph, and the database search is located on the right. I will be talking in collective numbers for each of the tier of the exclusion process between both of these inputs of information. Of the 1,076 total records, I removed 33 that pertained to European bison. For comprehensive bison status assessments and large reference material, I performed one iteration of reviewing literature cited material of the record as well as the record itself. This is where I get 776 identified records from the BSG original 164 sources. In the second tier of the exclusion process, 557 records were removed that did not provide spatiotemporal data based off of the title, abstract, and results. An example here is that the record talked about ecology, but didn't specify spatial or temporal parameters of the process. So I also removed 170 duplicates in this tier. In the third tier of exclusion, I removed 156 records that specifically talked about bison ecological processes and also talked about spatio and temporal scales, but did not have extractable data for the purposes of this study. An example here is that a record talked about multiple ecological processes and multiple points at which time and space could be oriented to those processes, but didn't make a clear connection to where I felt confident including. From these exclusions, 157 total records were included. 108 were from the BSG and 49 from the database search, providing 459 total data points, 78 of which only provided a spatial parameter, 157 of which provided a temporal parameter, and 224 providing both. And lastly, this is a breakdown of the frequency of ecological processes that appeared in records that were either only spatial, only temporal, or both. We're not going to go into this right now, but we will discuss some of the implications of this later on in the presentation. I gathered a lot of information for each data point to enhance understanding and identify data patterns later on in objectives 2 and 3. The ones most important in analysis are fencing, whether the observed population was fenced, the subspecies associated with the data point, whether the information was explicitly or implicitly gathered. And an example here was whether the record explicitly stated a spatiotemporal parameter or if it was implicitly stated. An example here would be a process occurring between mid-June to mid-July. I equated that to the 15th of the month to the 15th of the month so that I could have a hardcore temporal stamp. Of course, I had the ecological processing component and the observed spatial scale of the ecological process and the length in days of the ecological process. And then lastly, the ecoregion level 1 from the US EPA. This is the most coarse ecoregional boundary as opposed to very, very niche ones. Now, we're going to go over some of the fun results of the descriptive data associated with the extracted data points I got from literature review. This is a map of North America depicting all the locations provided in literature review. Locations are colored and sized by the number of data points that were gathered from the locations. Data was extracted from 44 locations across North America. 37 of these locations provided spatiotemporal data. 20% of these observations were from Yellowstone National Park, 14% from Wood Buffalo National Park, 10% from the Mackenzie Bison Sanctuary, and the remaining 56% was split among the remaining 34 locations. Spatiotemporal data points only counted for about 49% of all data points extracted. I focused on these data points for objectives 2 and 3. Some of the breakdowns of these data points are shown here. 37% of the extracted data points provided explicit spatiotemporal parameters. There's a pretty even split between data points gathered from the US and Canada, a 70-30 split between unfenced and fenced herds, and then lastly, a 64 and 46 split between the plains and woods subspecies. Of the 30% of fenced populations, all were of the fence or were the plain subspecies. Of the 70% of unfenced populations, there was an even split between the wood and plain subspecies. This is a nice 33% split between the number of data points of fencing and subspecies combination, which we'll get into a little bit later. This is a breakdown of the ecoregional differences in data points. You can see that there is pretty equal coverage between the taiga, northwestern forested mountains, and the Great Plains, with a few data points coming from northern forests and others. This is a histogram showing the range and frequency of publications in literature. Total range spanned the years of 1941 to 2022, with relatively equal coverage over the 40 years between 1980 and 2020. This collection consisted of 79 different primary authors. So jumping right into objective 2, as a reminder, it was to create a heuristic model of bison ecology over time and space based off of this information that I gathered. Only using those spatiotemporal data points again, only ecological components that had at least 3 points were used for analysis. 21 of the 26 ecological components met this criteria. Components that were excluded include climate-dependent movement, gene flow introgression, copulation tending, interspecific aggression, and birth synchrony. For each ecological component, I calculated the average over time and space, as well as ±1 standard error for time and space. This is my base heuristic model of bison ecology over time and space. Time is on the x-axis with space on the y. You'll notice that there is a scale break on the y-axis to show the jump from square meters to square kilometers. Both time and space here are represented in log 10 increments. Ecological processes are denoted by color, and ecological components are individual points. I won't go over each ecological component today, but visually we can see some structure to the scaling of ecological processes and components over time and space. Certain components occur across small scales, and other ones are occurring across larger ones. And to identify where bison ecology kind of falls within the current management paradigm, a representation of the spatial and temporal parameters for wild bison herds was overlaid onto the graph. 58 conservation herds identified by the IUCN in Rogers 2021 were assessed. So 58 different herds. 25% of these herds occur at or less than 50 square kilometers. Temporal parameters here are displayed as indicators of regular management disruption to bison herds, which often depends on the spatial scale at which populations are managed. Temporal restrictions are not impervious boundaries, which is why they're dotted here. They can be hard to measure and cannot be extensively confined. But for these herds on small landscapes, bison are often subject to seasonal pasture rotation, frequent management actions at least, which is a known contributor to domestication. And it appears that management isn't conserving a large portion of their ecology. Half of conservation herds occur at or less than 195 square kilometers. These herds, as they occupy larger areas, are able to express a larger portion of their total ecology over time, with conservation capturing more, but some things are still missing. However, they are subject to annual total herd gathers, which also contributes to their domestication as a remnant of cultural animal husbandry practice. These gathers alter their population demography and potentially the expression of their ecology in various ways. 75% of herds occur at or less than roughly 1,300 square kilometers. Some of these herds are still subject to annual gathers, but the majority closely follow traditional wildlife techniques through yearly to decadal management plans that incorporate minimally invasive fair chase hunting and population monitoring. For these herds, they generally freely express the full suite of their ecology, and these herds have established natural predators. This visual isn't perfect though, since many ecological processes are density-based. This approach is a broad explanation of bison as a species in aggregate, since multiple populations contributed to the information at varying densities. Also, because I only used one standard error for each point, the full range of all these ecological components is not fully expressed on the graph. So more of these processes are being captured at smaller scales. Since spatial temporal data points only counted for 49% of all the data points extracted from literature review, I prepared box plots depicting the ecological components over just time to include the 34% of extracted data points that did not have a spatial dimension. I did the same thing for time with the 17% of spatial data points that did not have a temporal dimension. I did this to provide a visual tool to highlight the extent of variability in some of the ecological components that I may or may not have captured in my analysis. Basically, to get an idea, if I could have used all the data points, would it be telling a different story than the one that I found? So this is the temporal box plot. The colors correspond to the ecological processes, which are labeled above, and the components are labeled below. Colored boxes indicate the spatiotemporal data points used in analysis, and the open dashed boxes represent all of the temporal data points extracted from literature review, regardless of if they had a corresponding spatial dimension. We can see that a few of the ecological components used in analysis focus on higher or lower ends of the temporal ranges extracted from literature review, or a couple that seem to break away from the total temporal ranges. This highlights that some ecological component research rarely reports on spatial parameters. Overall, though, the majority of ecological components fall within total temporal ranges extracted from literature review, providing a bit more confidence against errors when including more data. Ecological components were ordered by median value of total temporal data points. Here we have the spatial box plot. Ecological processes and components are ordered the same in this one as the temporal, and we see a little bit less disparity between the total spatial data points and the spatiotemporal data points. This is likely due to the smaller percentage of only spatial data points that were gathered from literature review. That was much smaller, about half of the temporal. We do see across the spatial gradient some ecological components that have corresponding temporal dimension focus around the median or edge on the higher and lower range. But again, overall, we see that for the spatial dimension, the utilized spatial temporal data points, seem to capture ecological components as they occur across space for the most part. This gives us a little bit more confidence in the data used for analysis, since we were only using a subset of 50% of extracted data. And hence that if we were able to increase sample size for these ecological components, that we might likely still be within normal parameters. So lastly, moving on to objective 3. Fulfilling this objective is twofold. This is where I perform my statistical analyses to identify what descriptive data and characteristics best explain my data spread overall, and gain a little bit of empirical support for my hypothesis of scaled ecology. Using the information found in analysis, I then have a more focal confidence in the areas where management and research need to adapt for the conservation of wild bison into the future. And in order to complete this first part of the objective, I performed an AIC model selection test, following the method of maximum likelihood for identifying data pattern drivers. I had 7 determined models based on the descriptive information gathered on data points. And the AIC utilized records for which both spatiotemporal data was reported and provided adequate sample size for each model variable that I tested. The explanatory variable was time, and the response variable was space in all models except the null, which had a y-intercept but no explanatory variable. Spatial and temporal data was log10 transformed to fall within assumptions of normality. So the 7 models that I ran through AIC were a null to compare for stochasticity, a standard regression across all data points over time and space, comparing data that was implicitly or explicitly extracted from literature review, whether the observed population was fenced, comparing the wood and plain subspecies, a combination of these two, and finally, a model based on ecoregion of the observed population. I'm just going to quickly cover some of the important pieces of an AIC for those who may not be familiar. The best fit model will always be listed first in the column, followed by the next best plausible model, and so on. The K value indicates the number of parameters that there are in the said model. The default is 2, and for each increase in K, there is an added penalty to analysis that the model must overcome. In these, the AICC is the information score of the model. The lower the score, the better the model fit. These numbers aren't particularly important by themselves. It's how they relate to other numbers associated with models. The delta AIC is the difference in AIC score from the best fit model to the model that is being compared. For my study, delta scores greater than 2 were not considered plausible. And lastly, the AIC weight indicates the predictive power provided by all of the models contained in the model that is being assessed. The higher the AIC weight, the higher degree of explanation of the data. So these are the results of the AIC analysis that I ran. Although having the second to highest number of independent variables, the fencing and subspecies combination was the identified best fit model, carrying 68% of the cumulative weight explanation of the data, suggesting that bison ecology is not random across scales of time and space, as the null model was not empirically supported and far removed from the best fit. I also want to point out that since the model for explicitly and implicitly gathered material was not supported, it provided an additional quality control against human error associated with my data collection. So I can be confident that implicitly gathered data doesn't deviate from what I would likely see if that data was explicitly stated in the first place. Lastly, I'd like to bring attention to the ecoregional model, as it was very close to the delta cutoff point. We know that ecoregional differences can have varying effects on the expression of ecology, and so of course it would be an effective explanation of the data spread. But after digging a little bit deeper, we can see that excluding this model as the best explanation does not remove its relevance from the results. It was already embedded into the fencing and subspecies combination model. As you can see here in this table, taiga was dominated by unfenced wood bison. Northern forest and northwestern forested mountains were dominated by unfenced plains bison, and the Great Plains were dominated by fenced plains bison. So ecoregion is inherently associated in these 3 groupings, which is why the fencing and subspecies combination model most accurately represents the data with the least number of variables. So This is a graph depicting all of the included data points with our best fit model on top. When separated by fencing and subspecies, there is a clear structure to bison ecology across scales of time and space. I also conducted a pairwise analysis to consider points at the mean and plus and minus 1 standard deviation, in which slopes may be significantly different from each other over time. Deviations from overlapping 95% confidence intervals occur at less than 40 days and within 1 square kilometer when back transformed. You can see that the slopes between unfenced bison and unfenced plains and unfenced wood bison are virtually identical. This shows that plains and wood bison express their ecology similarly, but wood bison require increased amount of space, which is consistent with what we know about ecoregional differences between the species, as well as Bergman's rule that an increase in mass requires an increase in space. Wood bison are larger of the two subspecies, and on average are 15% heavier than plains bison. However, fencing has a significant effect on the expression, or has a substantial effect on the expression of plains bison ecology. By either preventing them from expressing the full suite of ecological processes or pressuring them to express these processes in different ways. This impact is an expected one and supports the growing research on the adverse effects of fences on wildlife ecology globally. Fencing has been and will continue to be a necessary and effective management tool for restoration efforts. But in order to conserve total bison ecology into the future, management will need to explore efforts to mitigate the effects fencing and spatial restriction has on bison. This will not only benefit bison as wildlife, but landscape scale conservation and the cultural value they represent to a variety of communities. There are multiple ways in which management can adapt that generally employ either spatially expanding where feasible or manipulating ecological processes to occur within current spatial boundaries where expansion is not feasible. I don't have time to go to each and every one of these ecological components to identify where management could adapt, but I'll talk about a few major ones. Let's look at flight, which is associated with predation from the results of my literature review. So I just want to make that distinction. Range expansion, and large-scale population demography and genetics. I'd like to preface that the options that I use here are just examples for solutions where solutions could be applied, and that I can't necessarily advocate specifically for any of these examples just because the complexity of stakeholder and management situations varies among herds. So, some of the examples where management could increase boundaries to capture these processes include incorporating shared stewardship approaches to bison management by removing internal or shared fencing between established conservation herds to allow for increased landscape use and potentially combined populations as opposed to multiple small ones for increased genetic stability. An example would be here, as you can see with Wind Cave National Park and Custer State Park in South Dakota. They each have a conservation herd of bison and share an internal boundary fence, of which, if it was removed, wouldn't necessarily increase too many wildlife-human interaction conflict. Or here with Badlands National Park and Pine Ridge Reservation, where they share a boundary fence and could potentially have a large conservation area increase. In both of these situations, national forest and national grasslands surround the conservation areas as well, highlighting that expansion beyond borders is not impossible, but again, each individual situation has its own complexities that likely make some options not feasible. Another example is large land restoration projects as seen with American Prairie in central Montana. Even though there's a substantial amount of private land intermixed, that's the white in here, opportunities to buy land and secure BLM grazing leases adjacent to national wildlife refuges and monuments provide spatial expansion to create a mosaic of connected prairie. Natural predators are expected to recolonize the Missouri River breaks here through immigration, and this increased area of protection for predators may help that establishment. And lastly, habitat crediting programs for connecting conservation areas across private land will be very useful as 90% of grasslands are privately owned. However, many conservation herds do not have the feasibility to expand spatially and will require solutions to conserve bison ecology within set management boundaries. While range expansion really isn't something that we can manipulate to occur within management boundaries, there are other processes such as seasonal range movement that do have potential, as well as the flight and population demography we mentioned before. For flight associated with predation, where natural predators are absent, population management could shift away from large gathers for culling operations and incorporate fair chase hunting to stimulate more natural predator response and mitigate domestication influences, while also providing opportunities to enhance local economies and public perceptions of bison as a wildlife species. For long-term population demography and genetics, Hartway et al. 2020 has a phenomenal plan with a uniform translocation strategy across DOI herds to connect isolated populations through a meta-population management plan, which incorporates roughly 2 bison every 10 years or 3 bison every 7 years, translocated from the least genetically related herds. This could also be expanded by incorporating state, nonprofit, and tribal nations to widen the pool of population transfer. Lastly, for stimulating processes such as seasonal range use or herbivory patterns, incorporating fire to optimize range productivity and create high-value locations seasonally is one approach. It may do some alleviation of density-based increases based on ecological processes. And while there are multiple other avenues I would love to explore, there are just a few. And if I had more time, I would love to discuss about all of them in depth. But I'll have to move on. By isolating bison ecological processes over time and space, managers may be able to work on small or large scale improvements to better conserve the totality of bison ecology into the future. Of course, with every model, there are faults, and I've identified some areas where improvements could be made. In the future, the heuristic model could be revisited to display and isolate these differences in subspecies, ecoregion, density, and fencing, to help managers get a better sense of where their individual herds express their ecology on this model. But we're constrained a little bit by the time in this project to have multiple iterations of heuristic model creation. And this first iteration, visually depicting spatiotemporal scale, may be improved if ecological components were displayed as minimum and maximum polygons for ranges, as opposed to just averages, because some of that can be a little bit skewed by the very large population sizes that were coming from Canada. Literature review also identified some gaps in bison ecology research that could be addressed. For many ecological components, research reported on a single dimension of time and space. Depending on the nature of the process, this made mapping ecology across those spatiotemporal scales a little bit difficult. And I also found that research on ecological processes of small scale were primarily studied in small herds, where large processes were studied on large herds. This makes sense for obvious reasons, as small herds are easily accessible for frequent and routine observations, and large herds more clearly exhibit those ecological processes that many small herds are restricted from. However, investigating larger scales of ecology in spatially confined herds would be a useful tool in identifying if bison exhibit these processes differently as an adaptive tool and necessity for ecosystem engineering specific to physical confinement, or if they simply cannot express it at all. Similarly, there could be potential differences in the expression of small-scale processes between large and small herds. And there are other areas of research I found in my literature review that I'd love to address again, but I just don't have the time to do so today. So please feel free to reach out to me if you are curious after the presentation. Sanderson et al. Provided us with the Vermejo statement, of which a portion reads, over the next century, the ecological recovery of the North American bison will occur when multiple large herds move freely across extensive landscapes within all major habitats of their historic range, interacting in ecologically significant ways with the fullest possible set of other native species and inspiring, sustaining, and connecting human cultures. They identified that restoring wild bison into the future requires management to capture ecological functionality of the species. But at the time, they weren't really able to identify ways to measure it. This project taps into the possibility of using spatiotemporal scaling as one of the methods to assess ecological functionality by identifying where management is and isn't capturing ecological processes. For the first time to our knowledge, comprehensive ecology of a wildlife species has been mapped across scales of both time and space. For bison, mapping scalar ecology provides a new perspective on assessing and visualizing conservation needs in their restricted state. So we can continue to work towards restoring ecological functionality, even in the face of complex barriers and sentiments of wild bison thresholds. This framework to scaled wildlife ecology is an important step in the future of wildlife conservation globally, as this method is applicable to any species. Approaching wildlife and biodiversity conservation through the spatiotemporal lens will provide scientists and managers with another tool to comprehensively map the needs of important and ecologically important species. This will be valuable as managers work to address complex and diverse issues in conservation wildlife ecology as a whole. So with that, thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have. Okay, Letty.
I just had a question on, on your graph where you were showing that the eco region was really important between the wood bison, buffalo, and then the plains bison. I was wondering, so my idea of where the wood bison live is an image of whooping crane habitat, where there's like all these, because in Wood Buffalo National Park up there, there's all these like wetlands, and it's really difficult to move across larger expanses of the landscape. And I was just wondering where those wood bison, like what's their habitat look like, where they're located, and do they need more areas? Because some of like, maybe like what would be connected space, maybe they have to move further away because the connected space is less. I just don't know. I was just wondering.
So I'm not an expert on wood bison per se, but some of the things that I can think of right off the top of my head include wood bison have different herbivory across seasons, and they go to different areas where the best energy can be achieved, as opposed to plains bison, where some of that is pretty consistent with the types of grasses that they eat year round. For wood bison, they'll eat lichen in the mid-fall. They'll go into the forest and eat lichen. They'll come out into the winter and go towards those wetland sedgy areas because the ground is a little bit more frozen, so they can actually reach those areas without getting stuck. And then in the summertime, go towards those grassy meadows. I think that's a very general application. I know it's probably not true for all herds, but I think that's why. So yes, they have a lot less singular locations, and so they move to multiple different locations seasonally.
And then I have one more follow-up to that.
Sure.
But the other thing I was thinking about too is, as you head north into sort of Canada and some of those areas, you have maybe higher frequency of wolves, which would be a potential predator for bison, like in your picture you had up there.
Yep.
So, and that would seem to me that's also a large difference too, maybe with your. Absolutely.
So that is just one thing that I touched on about the natural predators. We know that Yellowstone National Park, we have wolves there, and so we get to have a little bit of an idea of what plains bison ecology with wolves looks like. And we've had a nice, good, long amount of time now where we've had some studies on it. So that gap is changing a little bit, but in the whole, yes, that is going to be an issue to address, just because the likelihood of introducing plains wolves back into the Great Plains region is very minimal and not very likely. And so we'll have to find ways to mitigate around it.
Thanks. Somebody raised their hand.
Okay, I see someone over here on the chat, so I'll just look in the chat here. Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
It was Kate Schenecker from USGS.
Oh, was she just waving her hand?
Raised your hand.
Oh, okay. Oh dear. My apologies. Kate, I actually think if you unmute yourself, you can ask the question over the presentation.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I just wanted to say congratulations. That was a great presentation and really interesting work. very timely, really good. And I'm wondering, I know you're probably planning to publish this work, but how soon will your thesis be available?
Well, I have until August 4th to complete my thesis for the summer graduation, and that is my intended timeline.
Okay, great. Thanks.
But hopefully it'll be sooner than that.
Yeah.
So,
Great job.
do you have anything else to say there, Kate?
Nope, that was it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Yes.
So you've just looked at more than 100 years worth of literature or research on the bison. Were there things that you could tell have changed, like that the bison have changed because of the management strategies that we have put on them? Like, just for example, are they getting smaller? Are they getting less crazy? You know, I just wondered if you saw differences that have happened over 100 years of human intervention.
You know, there's a lot of answers to those questions, actually, and I'm glad you asked them. One of them is answering a question about have they gotten more crazy. If we look towards the commercial bison industry, they really do focus on removing animals that cause problems. And so, you know, they're kind of going into that domestication route of becoming more docile. I'm sure it'll take a very long time for them to be very explicitly different. But still, that is occurring. As far as conservation herds go, there is definitely something to be said about over-visitation and over-presentation of humans associated with bison in these park systems and, you know, areas where people flock to come and see them. And you see all of these issues with, you know, conflict where people are getting very, very close to bison when they are an established dominating animal of the landscape. And so I do think habituation is a very real issue with bison, although I can't say from the research that I didn't read any research that was saying this is actually happening. I think this is more from just a general overview of what I've read and what I've experienced. But there are some other things that have changed. So I would say that, actually, I'm gonna leave it at that. I could go on and on, but I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
That was an excellent presentation. So thank you for that. So I guess this question mostly has the Nebraska sandhills in mind. So there's, you know, for people that have listened to talking about grassland management up there, mostly it's fires and grazing. And usually the grazing side right now is obviously on cattle. There are some efforts to have bison up there, including, you know, connecting multiple ranches, but still, you know, this is obviously very dense. So I was curious in the sense, like, how big does the space need to be before the fencing starts to matter a little less? And maybe that you couldn't put an exact number to that, but is there any like difference you can see that, like, if the fenced area is so big, it starts to matter a little bit less that they're fenced, or does that ever happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, it's a gradient. Absolutely. And of course, it's density based. If we only have a, you know, quote unquote herd of 20 bison that are hanging out in 500 square kilometers, they're not really going to feel the pressures of that fence, right? So I think there's a lot of different factors that go into it. But to answer your question, I think on the whole, conservation herds do need an increase. Generally, we're not keeping them in enough areas where they have the space to fully express their ecology. So I know that doesn't give you an exact answer, but I think spatial increase is definitely warranted for a large portion of herds. And I actually just remembered some answers to your question, because you originally asked, are they getting bigger, are they getting smaller? Martin et al. Has really touched on that with plains bison, I believe, getting smaller over time. And that is, I think, is associated with latitudinal ranges and climate change. So, yes. Are there did I see anything on the Zoom? If anyone on Zoom has a question, feel free to just go ahead and unmute and ask your question now. Okay. All right, if there are no other questions.
Hi, Joe.
Oh, there is one. Okay. Hi, is that Glenn?
Hi, yep, this is a quick one. Great job. On the regression graph that you have of the fenced and unfenced data, I
Sure.
believe the green curve is the of the fenced plains. And it had a very low R squared, very low fit.
Oh, gosh.
If I recall, it's 0.13.
Yeah, it is
Um,
pretty small. Yes.
How do you interpret that type of data? And does that low R squared, that low fit,
Oh,
influence the transferability of that interpretation? And how might you resolve that R squared?
that is a very good question. Thank you very much for asking it. I'll just pull up this one here. Just so that everybody can see. Apologize.
Is that you scuba diving?
I'm sorry, did I miss it?
Yeah, is that you scuba diving?
Oh, I wish. No. That's a free diver. That's just a regular one, but I do like to scuba dive. So yes, the R squared value for fenced plains bison is very low in comparison to the unfenced wood and unfenced plains. I do think a large portion of this is associated with the type of research that we do on fenced plains bison, as we don't have as much a spread across temporal timeframes. And so I think that is, contributing to that, and also why I think I might go back to that information I got from literature review, where fenced plains bison herds may really benefit from research approaches that incorporate potential large-scale processes, because we know that fencing is affecting them, but in what way, we could dive into a little bit more, and to see potentially some of these ecological processes are being changed. They're a very adaptive species. They do very well in a variety of locations. And so from personal experience, I can give a short example. There is at Theodore Roosevelt National Park, we have a herd of bison in the South Unit, and I'm familiar with some of their movements. They have, roughly, well, they've got 46,000 acres. I can't remember the square kilometer. I think it's 185 square kilometers of space, but they use that whole area annually, but they very clearly change their behavior seasonally and have seasonal range locations that they prefer in the winter and in the summer. Even though they're using that whole area all year round, in the winter, they're choosing a very specific part of the park where they like to focus their time. And so to me, that indicates that there is potentially this adaptive seasonal range ecological process occurring within this fenced herd. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. Great job.
Thank you. Dustin.
Joe, do you think that with this R squared question as well, do you think it could be also the result of, you mentioned that the fencing could be influenced or pressuring bison to express their ecology in different ways? Could that have a factor here where just that pressure to express it differently may lead to different expressions between different herds because of the shapes and configurations of the different fences, population density,
Yeah,
etc.?
absolutely. I think that is an excellent point. I would love to approach this on an individual herd basis and have all 58 conservation herds with their individual heuristic models. In an ideal world, if I had all the time, I would do it. But I also, on another point of that is potentially the way that fencing is impacting bison ecology. If we were to explore it in this way, again, it, is trying to show that their ecology isn't scaled in time and space from the process of this model selection. And so it seems almost counterintuitive, where it's like the fencing is making the data seem like it's not scaled in time and space because they're conflicted, confined. So I think it's like a back and forth piece there. Any other questions on Zoom? I think there's a chat, but I don't know if it's a. Okay. I appreciate all the love and support, and thank you so much for all of the questions. They were great. And thanks again for everyone who has come to be a part of this today. All right, for everyone who's on Zoom, we are going to close out here. So thank you again for your time, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend. Yeah.
Good luck with.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I gotta stop this recording real fast.